So I was just going to do, I'm a PhD student working with Seth Crutch. Lots of you will have met me already from the support groups and from taking part in research. So I'm going to give you a brief talk about one part of the research that I've been doing while here. And that's a questionnaire called the Cambridge Behaviour Inventory that we've been giving to people that know someone with PCA well, so often a friend or a relative. And the questionnaire has kind of sets of questions that fit into different categories. So there's some questions about things like everyday skills, orientation to time and place, things like memory, mood, and awareness about people's own problems. And so we've been giving this to people who have posterior cortical atrophy. And the idea is, it might not tell you much that we all don't already know. It might not tell us much. There's lots of things that we'll have heard from individual people that we're hoping to collect in a kind of organised way. And by putting that information from lots of people together, and by collecting the data over a period of time and following people up, we hope to get a better idea of the different stages that people go through and the different symptoms and problems that people have at different stages. So I'm going to show you some of the initial results from that study, which I think about 20 people have taken part in so far. And this graph here shows you the percentage of people that have severe deficits. So that's having problems with the symptom every day or constantly. And as you can see, a very high proportion of people that I gave the questionnaire to have problems with everyday skills, things like making cups of tea, answering the telephone, that sort of thing, quite frequently. Whereas things like awareness of people's own condition are usually fine, and people's mood generally isn't too impaired, and people's disinhibition, that's kind of ability to stop yourself doing something that you know you shouldn't do, usually relatively not a problem compared to things like everyday skills, which really cause a big problem for lots of people. And some people find that they need a little bit of help to do lots of things they used to be able to do. So we can compare those results to people who have what we call typical Alzheimer's disease, which is where it's kind of memory is the first problem that people have rather than their vision. And here we see that there's much more problems, especially with things like awareness and memory compared to with people with PCA. And you can see it's a very different pattern of things that people have problems with. So that kind of starts to explain why people often don't recognise PCA very well. So the one thing we can notice is that people with PCA actually have more problems with everyday skills than the people with typical Alzheimer's disease that we tested. And I expect you've noticed that this questionnaire doesn't ask any questions about people's vision, and that's one thing that was missed off when the original questionnaire was made. So we adapted the questionnaire in order to add questions about vision, people's understanding of numbers, and people's ability to use language. And we found that in these three additional sections, people with PCA, a much greater number of people with PCA had problems than in the other questions that we asked about. And so what this suggests to us is that it's really important to ask about these extra things, and that if you don't ask those things, you might not see why people with PCA have such great problems in their everyday skills. So this kind of tells us, so far it's told us kind of what we already know, that people with PCA have more problems with vision, understanding things about numbers, than people with typical Alzheimer's disease. But as we follow it up, and as we test people year after year, we'll be able to see how these things change over time, and then it will hopefully enable us to better answer the kinds of questions that people often ask, things like, where will I be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? How do things change over time? What are the stages of PCA? And understand kind of how things change. So that's all I wanted to show you. Has anyone got any questions about the questionnaire or that Lisa? Yes?
Well, how long you get different answers depending on how long after diagnosis you ask those questions. snapshot across the board?
So, the question was, does it make a difference when you ask people after their diagnosis, and how does that affect the results? So, in the results that I showed you, all these people were asked roughly 4 to 6 years after diagnosis, and that was comparable in the people with PCA and the people with typical Alzheimer's disease. But obviously that's one thing that so this is a kind of single snapshot, but as we carry on doing this test over time, we hope to be able to break that down so we can look kind of 2 years after diagnosis, 4 years, 6 years, and so on. And that will hopefully better answer lots of the questions that we have about stages of PCA.
Yeah. I think age also has an impact on the progression of the disease.
Okay.
Did that come into the analysis at all?
So at the moment, it's not something we've looked at. We've only got about 20 people or so, and they're...
Could you repeat that question? I'm sure.
Yes, sorry. So the question was, how might age affect the pattern of impairment? So at the moment, we've got a kind of group of people of different ages, probably between 55 and 75, and we don't have enough numbers of different ages to look at that in detail. But that's absolutely something that we should look at to see if there's a difference between younger people who have PCA and older people who have PCA. So can I ask Richard?
Are you able to take into account drug treatments, paracetamol, with each candidate?
So the question is, do we take into account the drug treatments that people might be on? And again, so far we haven't done that. And I think the majority of people will be on one of the kind of typical drugs for people with Alzheimer's disease, like Aricept or patches that people have. And that's something that we will have to take into account when we get kind of a larger sample of people. Absolutely.
How are you going to get the larger sample?
So the plan is oh, sorry, thank you. So the question is, how are we going to get the larger sample, and how are we planning to work it out? So it's gradually, we only started collecting this information relatively recently, so the plan is to do it with all the people that take part in our research. So the full list of questions is about 100 questions, so it's quite a lot to get through, but often the person that comes with someone with PCA sits in the waiting room and has a bit of time to fill those out, so we usually ask them to do that. And then we hope to follow that up, either when people come back in or by sending it out by letter or by calling people up to get them to carry on doing it if they're willing to. And I think that's something that we are going to kind of prioritise, so that we make sure that there's someone responsible in the research group for doing that, collecting that information. Yes?
Could you tell me, as this is such a small sample, are you liaising with America or other places in Europe?
So the question is, are we liaising with people in America or other places in Europe? And at the moment, in this particular questionnaire, we're not. So we've only recently started doing it, and in a small group of people. So I think that's something that we could do. There's not, at the moment, there's not a lot of standardization between different groups in terms of the questions and the kind of tests that people do. So often we find that people in the Americas will do different sorts of tests than we would do here. There are some kind of more standard things that people do use. I think if we show this to be helpful, there are international collaborations that we are working with people in different groups in different countries that we could kind of show it to them, saying this works really well for us, why don't you give it a try in your group as well? And that is happening for some other areas of research that we're doing. So, for example, in genetic analysis, where it's really important to have really large numbers in order to get a good idea of whether there could be genetic variations that contribute or are factors towards the likelihood of having PCA. SEB has set up a group where people from different centres have agreed to donate the blood samples that they've collected, so we can do one big study with all the people with PCA that have had that kind of sample, and to get a better idea of whether there are genetic factors that could influence disease.
Tim, I've got a question from Cleveland, Ohio.
Yes.
Saying any information on coloured lenses or glasses, 2 iPhone apps that are helpful, 3, can she get a copy of your articles in optometry practice?
Yes, sorry, I think it starts making a buzz when I turn around there. So the question is, are coloured lenses helpful? And can she get a copy of an article in optometry in practice?
And which iPhone apps you use?
And iPhone apps. So I'll start with the easiest one, which is optometry in practice. So this is something that Seb and I and Natalie, who's a neurologist at some of you met, and ophthalmologist all contributed to writing to put in the Continuing Professional Development Journal for the Royal College of Optometrists to explain what PCA is and how it's diagnosed and what kind of things people might notice. So hopefully some of them might read it and might, when they see someone who has PCA, be more likely to pick it up and refer them on to a neurologist. And so if anyone wants a copy of that, you're absolutely free to email Jill or I, and we can email it to you. So the second question was coloured glasses. So some of you will have thought about this before. In dyslexia, where people have somewhat similar reading problems to people with PCA, some people have found that using coloured glasses, for example, yellow or blue coloured glasses, improves people's ability to read. And there is a kind of proposed mechanism in the brain by which that might be helpful. And that hasn't been tried out in people with PCA before. There's one study with one person where they found that yellow glasses helped on a very specific test, but we don't know whether it's going to help people in everyday life or help people in reading. And it's something we're planning to look into, but it's not something we've been able to do so far. So I think there's no harm in trying it, but we don't know whether that's something that's going to work or not. And there was, what exactly about iPhone apps?
If there are any useful ones. Any useful ones?
I don't know of any iPhone apps. Has anyone else got any experience using iPhone apps or iPads or anything like that?
I remember we got very excited about voice recognition. Siri,
Okay, so things like Siri, voice recognition, where you can just tell it what to do and it will do it for you.
not like it.
No, okay, so it's not, people find out and find it not helpful. Okay. So some people found that quite difficult to use.
It would be useful actually to put out through the newsletter and through the website and perhaps get feedback and share information that way.
Does anyone else have any questions?